Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to lecture 14 of this course on machine learning for earth system science. We are right now in module 2, which is about review of machine learning techniques relevant for this course. So today we will talk about sequential models for temporal problems in earth sciences. So the main concepts to be covered in this lecture are latent state in sequential models, the hidden Markov models to recurrent neural networks, and from LSTMs to conv LSTMs. So first of all, let's talk about temporal data. So like here we have the temporal data, we can also consider as sequential data. So like here the data is comes in a sequence like this, x1, x2, etc. Now this is different from normal data set in the sense that these these 1, 2, etc. these are not just arbitrary serial numbers, but they define some kind of a sequence, that is data x2 follows data x1, data x3 follows data x2, and so on. Now this x, this is a variable, it can be a scalar, that is either real or discrete, or it can be a vector or matrix, tensor, whatever. Now if x is some kind of a spatial map, like the let us say something like an image, the kind of or the kind of spatial data which we discussed in the last lecture, then it's basically a sequence of spatial data. So like we can call it as a spatiotemporal sequence, and this xt we can consider it to be a function of the past observations x1, x2 up to xt minus 1. Now this kind of function which connects xt to the previous observations, this is usually modeled with the help of a latent state. That is, of course, we do not have access to the we do not have anything like when we only have the data, we don't have a like anything like what produces the data, but we imagine that there is a system which is generating the data, and the system we imagine it is having some kind of a latent state, and like which is defined at every time point, or and that latent state is driving the observations. Now so we basically we have a sequence of latent states like this, z1, z2, z small t up to z capital T, like this. So parallel to the sequence of observations x1, x2, we have this sequence of latent state, which of course we can we do not know its values because it is latent. It's like we just imagine these to be there. And now the dynamical model is like when we define how this state it changes over time, taking as input all the previous state values as well as the previous observations. So when we are defining zt, so we just imagine that there is a function f which takes as inputs all of them. Now of course this function f can be defined in different ways in different models, and of course not all of these inputs are going to be used. Different models use only different parts of these like of all these previous data. And then there is an observation model also, which is like so x is like what we can say this is the x are the inputs. Now corresponding to that we can have outputs also. So yt, the outputs, we can say these are what we get out of the system, that is like we define it in terms of another function g, and the output at any given state yt, like this is usually considered to be a function of the current system state only. Now these functions f or g, these can be either deterministic or probabilistic, and in either case like they can be defined in various ways. And this dynamical model which we mentioned, it is usually simplified to that zt, the current system state, is just a function of the current input xt minus 1 and the previous I am sorry, this will be xt, not xt minus 1, and zt minus 1, that is the previous state. That is the current state is a function of the previous state and the current input. Like there are multiple models which work on this kind of framework. So, basically in the case of the probabilistic model, zt is just considered to be as like a conditional probability distribution on using zt minus 1 and maybe xt if it is there. So, if so in case of hidden Markov model, which is the most famous probabilistic model, there the x is not present, there is no concept of the input x, there is just z. So, in that case, in case of hidden Markov model, zt is just like it's a discrete variable and this f is a categorical distribution. So, zt is a discrete variable which follows a categorical distribution taking zt minus 1 as the input. And now then there is another kind of model called the linear dynamical system. So, there z is no longer bound to be discrete, but rather zt is expressed as like in this way, as a times zt minus 1 plus b times xt. So, where xt is the current input and zt minus 1 is the past system state, and et is something like a random noise, and a and b are transformation matrices of the appropriate size. So, like depending on what this z is, whatever this z might be a scalar or it may be a vector or it can be a matrix or something like that. So, these a and b, like they are defined in a particular way, like so that this the whole thing is consistent with the laws of matrix multiplication. And this et, this is also some kind of a this is a random noise which is of the same size as zt. So, if zt is a scalar, then et will also be a scalar, and if zt is, let us say, is a vector or a matrix, then et will also be that, except that every element of et in that case we may assume to be following a random noise like this. Okay. Now, this so this z, as I said, like exactly what form it will take depends on the exact problem which we are trying to solve. Now, instead of a linear dynamical system, we can also have a non-linear dynamical system, and that forms the basis of what is known as the recurrent neural network. So, like instead of having just a linear function, I can apply some kind of non-linearity by putting in some suitable non-linear function like this. Now, this zt, the system state, this is expected to contain the information of all the past inputs x1, x2, etc. So, z1 like as we can understand, z1 takes in x1 and is a representation of x1. Now, z2 it takes in z1 as well as x2, but z1 contains we can say z1 contains x1. So, z2 will contain x1 as well as x2. Similarly, z3 again will contain x1, x2 and also x3 which will receive at the input and so on. So, we can also define a multi-layer RNN like this, that is, instead of having just a single like system state z, we can actually have several state variables like z1t, z2t, etc. Up to zkt, and these are also defined sequentially. That is, first z1, whenever the input comes in, so z1t is defined in terms of the past value of z1 and the current input xt. Now, that z1, once it is computed, that value of z1 is becomes input to the next layer, so where it is z2. So, z2 at time t, that again is a function of z2 at the previous time t minus 1 and z1 at time t, which has already been calculated. Now, once this z2 is calculated, now that it will be passed on to the third layer where z3 at time t will be calculated and so on. So, in that way we can say that we finally have the zk. So, the system state in this case now consists of k variables like this, and these functions f, these can also be arbitrarily complex functions. In fact, they can be these functions can themselves be represented as something like a neural network. So we already know that neural networks can be used to represent various functions. Now next comes the question of output. So x is the input, z is the system step. Now what is the output? So y we can denote it as an output. So the output can be anything, like it can be a single real value, a scalar. So it's like that is a situation when the input is a sequence x1 x2 up to x capital T, and the output is just one value y. So in that case we can express y as just g of z capital T, which is the final system state. That is the final, when the final system state is achieved when the entire input sequence has been received. So the z capital T in a sense contains the entire entire input information represented in some arbitrary way, and then on that I apply the function g and get the output. Now this g can be a non-linear function, and it can again be represented by another neural network. On the other hand, instead of having just a single scalar as the output, we can have a sequential output like this. So we can do at every time point y small t, I can expect an output like this y of small t, which is which is a representation of the current system state, that is z of small t. So is now z of small t, the current system step, is basically some representation of all the input received so far. So in that case, the output I am receiving yt at any given point of time is a function of the input that has been received till then. And an alternative to this is like we, instead of generating the sequence or the outputs instantaneously, we first absorb the entire sequence and get z of capital T, which is the, we can say, is some kind of an intermediate representation of the entire sequence. Then we define some kind of a like a decoder network, which we denote as H. So that H works on that intermediate representation z of capital T to produce an output sequence y. So like it's like saying that we have this this z prime is something like the output system state or the decoder system state. It starts with z capital T with the input, that is the representation of the input, and then the like in the output we have another sequential model and another RNN type of structure like this, where like at any or at each time step the corresponding output yt is generated, and again the system state is which is now denoted by z prime, that gets updated, and so that I can generate the next output and so on. Okay. So now these are all models, and each model comes with the different parameters. So the question is how to estimate all those parameters from the data. So in case of HMM or LDS, these are probabilistic models. So the parameters can be estimated using the EM algorithm or Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. Especially for hidden Markov models, there is the famous Baum-Welch algorithm for estimating the parameters, that is based on the EM algorithm. Now in case of recurrent neural network parameters, that is basically all those matrices, the like which we talked about, these matrices, the A, B, etc. So these matrices, they have to be calculated in case of an RNN, and that can be achieved with the what is known as the back propagation through time with the help of gradient descent. So just like in case of a normal neural network, all the edge weights, they are estimated through the process of back propagation, which is basically gradient descent, where the derivatives are calculated as using the chain rule. So here also the same idea, except that the back propagation now takes place through time. That is at every step we are considering the gradients of the previous time steps, and in that case also we are using the chain rule of differentiation as earlier. However, like when we are dealing with long sequences, this gradient descent causes us to multiply like long sequences or these or long chains of these derivatives, and as a result what happens is, because we are multiplying so many numbers, like it often happens that these gradients, they either tend to 0 or they tend to infinity. That's I mean it like that is you can easily understand. If the numbers are less than 1, then as you keep on multiplying many of them, the product will be tending towards 0, and if they are greater than 1 and if you keep multiplying them, it will be tending towards infinity. So this is the famous vanishing or exploding gradient problem of RNNs, and one way to solve it is the long short term memory networks, or the LSTM. And now the problem of this LSTM network, this solves a different problem also apart from this gradient problem. So that is related to the memory of old values. So in case of a hidden Markov model, the value of z, the hidden value, or the latent state value, that is sampled at every time step, and once an old state value is forgotten, or is overwritten, it does not play any further role in generating the outputs. So at any point, the output y, that depends only on the current value of the system state, but once that system state changes, then that the old value does not play any further role in a hidden Markov model. Now in case of these recurrent neural networks, the state variable keeps updating. Now the state variable is supposed to contain or be some kind of a representation of the past values. That is, we have already discussed that z of small t at any time t is, in a sense, it's a representation of all the inputs that have been received so far, x1, x2 up to x small t. But as t increases, the initial inputs like x1, x2, x3, etc., they become less and less important. That is, they are increasingly, their effects are overwritten by the new values that are coming in. So one solution to this problem might be to use multiple layers to remember the old values. So we have already talked about instead of having a single state value like zt, let us have multiple, let's have a sequence of state values z1, z2, zt, zk and so on, each of which is updated at every time step. So doing that might be a way to remember the old values. That is, it's basically we are increasing the memory of the network by adding layer of we can say we are adding a different memory cards or RAMs, if you want to imagine it that way, and though all the different memory cards are stacked with each other so that we have more memory. That is one way to do it. The alternative is we can have a separate long term state variable that is rarely updated. So in a sense, it's unlike the usual state variable zt, which is updated at on receipt of every input. We can have a long term memory also, which carries the values of the old variables, and it is not updated very frequently. Only when the network somehow decides that now it can forget the old values and focus on the new values only, then then it can do that. So it's like at every step it decides like whether some kind of a regime change has happened in the input. If that regime change has happened, then the previous values are not important, so it can forget them and focus on the new regime. But otherwise, if it is continuing in the same regime, then it just holds that value in the memory. So this is like what a LSTM or long short term memory cell looks like. Like as you can see that there are different variables like c, h, etc. This h is the hidden state, or you can call which is we can call it as the short term memory, and then we have ct, which is like the cell state. This is the long term memory. This is rarely updated. In fact, there is something called a forget signal, which is generated at whenever on the basis of the input x, and if the forget signal, if that is activated, then only this cell state gets updated with the current input. Otherwise, it just carries on with the previous value which it had. and the HT on the other hand, this is the short term memory which is updated at every step, just like in case of a normal recurrent neural network. And now even in case of the this kind of LSTM, I may want to increase its memory by so the like as I mentioned, there is this long term memory called the cell state which preserves the old values, but then again it is that cell state is also sometimes reset by like when that forget function is generated. So then but how to how to remember those or how to preserve those old values if I need it for the final output, right. So the way to achieve it is like just like in case of RNN, we talked about stacking multiple layers together, Z1, Z2, etc. Similarly, we can also stack different LSTM cells, etc. And so in each like we can have one layer of LSTM cells, on top of it we can stack another layer of these LSTM cells like this. So like you can see that there are these horizontal operations, that is in one layer the LSTMs like they function normally, that is on receiving the input they update the cell state and the hidden state and then pass on to the next layer, etc. But that those hidden state HT, that is again passed on to the next layer of LSTM cells where also the similar operation takes place. And if there are the outputs, they come out like at the end of these multiple layers. So just like we talked about the stacked RNN, we can have stacked LSTM also, and we can also have convolutional LSTM for the special situation where the inputs or the outputs, they are special maps. So if they like these inputs which we talked about, if these inputs are instead of being say vectors or matrices, if they are special maps. So like we earlier we talked about the input operations being something like this, right. So so like this is the system state and this is the input. So like there is some transformation matrices where this multiplication takes place, but in the special case where these x, these the inputs, these are special maps, then doing the usual vector or matrix multiplication may not be very useful, because they will be they won't be able to preserve the local special information which is present in the like in that kind of special data. So as we had discussed in the last class, these convolutional operations, this is very important for spatial data because they define some kind of interactions among the neighboring pixels. Now the solution to this problem can be to use the convolutional operations at every step whenever we are receiving an input. So we can like accordingly the input operations that can be defined in this kind of a way. So in that case the system state Z, that also we can express as like we can consider it as some kind of a spatial map like that, and all like these A and B, these can be considered to be convolution filters instead of transformation matrices, and this by this double star what I mean is the convolution operation. So instead of doing the usual matrix operation, we can do the convolution operation. And similarly when we are generating the output, the YT, that also can be the output that also can be obtained by something another round of convolution on the system state. So this way with what the kind of LSTM or RNN we get, that is called a convolutional LSTM or RNN. So all the concepts discussed so far, they find lots of applications in earth system science. So for example in time series forecasting, say suppose we want to forecast the weather for the next few days. So this is an example of a sequential prediction problem. Now this forecasting, this can be either scalar valued or it can be a spatial map. That is to say, we may want to forecast either the total amount of rainfall being that's going to happen in the next few days, or I may want a full spatial map of the rainfall distribution over a particular area for the next few days. So if we are going for the second thing, that is we want to predict a sequence of spatial maps, then that becomes a sequential prediction problem for which we need something like a convolutional LSTM. Another problem is that of temporal downscaling. So that is where we have a low resolution time series, maybe each time step is like 1 day or something like that, and we want to make it or infer a high resolution time series where the time steps are maybe say 1 hour or 6 hours, something like that. So for that purpose also the concepts discussed earlier, they have applications. And finally, in case of process model emulations, so where we have set some initial conditions for a particular model that simulates some geoscientific phenomena, let us say some hydrological model or something like that, and the expected output from that model is a sequence of a particular variable, say the temperature or something. The aim of this process model emulation is, without actually running the simulation model, I will just predict its output based only on its initial conditions. So this is like again a sequence prediction problem for which we can use the concepts discussed earlier. So these are a set of references which shows the applications of these LSTM networks for these, like in the various domains of earth system science. So the first one, this talks, as you can see, this is about the nowcasting of precipitation. Nowcasting means forecasting at short range, as we talked about here. Like another important application is that of temporal downscaling. So where we have, so this is an important interesting problem where the input is a time series and the output is also a time series. So this is the sequence to sequence mapping problem which we talked about. So the input is typically, it's a low resolution time series and the output is a high resolution time series. So this temporal downscaling is often achieved using an RNN, where you where I just mentioned, like there can be an encoder decoder framework where the encoder first receives the low dimensional sequence, and then there is a decoder which creates the output sequence. And the convolutional LSTM which I mentioned, this was actually first proposed specifically for the purpose of rainfall forecasting from from radar data. So the rainfall forecasting problem is actually cast as some kind of a spatiotemporal sequence forecasting problem. We will study the LSTM, the conv LSTM paper in greater details. So but that is a very important application where a famous machine learning technique was actually devised for the specific task in earth system sciences, and there are of course many other applications in hydrology and so on. So the key points to take away from this lecture is that like in these kinds of sequential problems, the system state is maintained as a latent variable and it is updated at each state. The state update can be either deterministic or probabilistic. Now and whenever we are like updating the step, like basically we need to remember the past values, which is usually achieved either through multiple layers of the state variable, or as in case of a stacked RNN, or in case of or with the help of a long-term memory unit as done in an LSTM. And the outputs like they can be like either the single value or another sequence. In case it is a sequence like in or in either case, the outputs can be generated either instantaneously, that is at every time step we can get an output, or we can receive the full input and then only produce the output. And especially if there are if the input is like spatial maps, or if the outputs are spatial maps, then we need convolutional operations at the input and output. So for that we have like conv LSTMs or convolution cum recurrent networks. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. So we will, like after in the next lecture 2, we will discuss some machine learning approaches which are relevant to this domain of earth system science. So till then, goodbye.